The King's Speech movie review. So this is one of my scripted reviews. When I go back and read a review I wrote 10 years ago on the weblog and try and make a YouTube video out of it for whatever that may or may not be worth. This particular movie, you may remember, came out about 10 years ago. I saw it when I was still living in Melbourne, Australia at the time. I mention that because if you've seen this movie, you know that there's a bit of an Australian connection. The character of the speech therapist, Lionel Logue, the historical figure, was actually from Australia. And the actor that they got to play him was Geoffrey Rush, who is also an Australian. That got a fair amount of publicity over in Australia when I was there. I remember hearing people talking about it, reading about it in some of the local newspapers. And also when I saw this in the movie theater in Melbourne, I remember people laughing a lot at all the Australian lines. Whenever there was a jab at Australians, people took it in good humor, and there was a lot of laughter in the theater. So yeah, that's my Australia connection mentioning there. On to the movie itself. You know, when this came out, I was actually not initially interested in seeing it. I thought, 2 hours about a speech impediment and some stupid speech that the king has to give, I'm not really interested. But then it started getting really good reviews. Like all the papers were giving it rave reviews, and also it, at least in my circle of friends, started getting really good word of mouth. You know, people I knew or hung out with were telling me how great the movie was. So I eventually decided to go see it, and yeah, what can I say? It was really good. I mean, it sounds like this would be really boring on paper, right? There's no big action scenes, there's no big explosions, but it was just really engrossing. And it just goes to show that with some good dialogue, some good acting, some witty one-liners, you can make something like this really interesting for 2 hours. And it was. There's not a lot of action in this movie. The climax of this movie, if you've seen it, is a character speaking into a microphone for 3 minutes. That's what everything's building up to. But all the conversations between the characters were really good. The film is really talky. It's mostly a bunch of people sitting around in rooms talking. It's so talky, I initially thought that this must have originated as a theater play. I thought, okay, I'm going to go up to Wikipedia, I'm going to look up the history of this movie. It's going to turn out that it was a stage play that was later adapted into a movie. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and unless I'm missing something, it looks like this was never a stage play. It was always a movie, but it seems like the kind of thing that could be a stage play. And I mean that sort of as a compliment. I mean that the dialogue really carries the scenes like they would if you were watching something in the traditional theater. The interesting thing about this story is that this is, in the scheme of things, a minor historical story. The king overcoming his speech impediment to give an inspirational speech on the eve of World War II. And the movie does build up the historical importance of the speech, and, I get it. It was a really important inspirational speech that the king was able to give, and it was a crisis in Britain's history, etc. But I don't know. If the speech hadn't gone as well, would it have made that much of a difference in the course of world history? You get the impression that maybe it's not that important. And what's interesting is there's some really interesting, more important stuff going on here, like World War II. And there's also the whole abdication crisis that leads up to this, where the king's brother, Edward VIII, eventually has to abdicate his throne, which is, one of those historical details that, at least in my history education growing up in America, I never heard about this. It's fascinating to think he was on the throne for about a year, and then he just abdicated. Like, that doesn't happen a lot in history. To a certain extent, while I was watching the movie, I was kind of thinking, who cares about this stupid speech impediment and this speech he's got to give? This whole drama with the abdication, that should be the real focus of this movie, huh? That's where the interesting story is. Now, sure enough, if you go to Wikipedia, this historical incident has not gone completely neglected by Hollywood. There have been a few movies about it. There have been a number of TV dramas, etc. So it has gotten covered. I think the issue is it hasn't gotten covered recently, or it hasn't gotten covered for our generation. Or I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. Let me know if I've got a blind spot out there. So for me, and I think a lot of other people who are watching this movie, this was our first introduction to the abdication crisis. And because it was potentially more interesting than the speech impediment, there was a danger that could take over the movie. And it almost did for a spot, but I think they kept it in its box. They kept it nicely as the subplot to the movie. So something that added a lot of interest, because it was an interesting story, but they didn't allow it to overshadow the main storyline. And it could have, but they did a nice job of balancing that out, I thought. So just enough of that to pique your interest and to get you more interested in the movie, but not enough to overwhelm the main storyline. My main criticism of this movie is that the main storyline gets a little bit repetitive. I'm reminded of some of the romance movies I've seen. 10 Things I Hate About You, I think, has got to be on the top of my worst offenders for this. But there are a number of other movies as well. Right. So a problem with a lot of romance movies is boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl. It's not enough to get a 2-hour movie out of. So a lot of romance movies is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl again. Okay, we still have another hour to go. Boy loses girl again. Boy gets girl again. Okay, we still have 30 more minutes. Boy loses girl again. Boy gets girl again. Some of these romance movies just pad out the time by having the couple fall out and in of love numerous times. I got the same vibe from this movie. Now, this wasn't a romance. This was more of a bromance between the two major characters. But it did seem like it went into cycles, where there were several times when the speech therapist, Lionel, had to win back the king's confidence. And by the third time or so, I thought the plot was beginning to move in circles, and that's when I got a little bit tired of this movie. Also, okay, this is another nitpick. So the whole premise of this movie is that nobody can help the king overcome his speech impediment. And then Lionel comes in with all these new unconventional methods, and he finally helps the king over his speech impediment. And the reviews I had read about this movie led me to believe that this film would be an examination about how these radical, new, unconventional methods that all the establishment disapproved of were able to save the day. And that itself is kind of a cliched plot in and of itself, right? Like, this has been done before in a million different movies, Patch Adams or Dead Poets Society. It's a particular trope among Robin Williams movies, obviously, where somebody comes in with all these new unconventional methods and upsets the establishment. And that's kind of what they're going with here, only we never really get to see what these methods are and why they're so unconventional. In fact, the brief view we get of these methods, they really look actually quite conventional. In fact, it seems to me that it's the methods that the other speech therapists are using that are really unconventional. You know, like that, the beginning of the movie, we see where the king has all these speech therapists who are not helping him. And those methods look like they're the really whacked out, unconventional methods. And I know one of them, Demosthenes Pebble's method, is straight out of antiquity. You know, there's this famous Greek orator who famously taught himself to speak by stuffing his mouth full of pebbles. But that's a legend. I don't know. Were people actually doing that in the 20th century? That strikes me as a bit unconventional. Like, you know, I get that it has its basis in ancient Greek stories, but yeah, it seems to me like the movie formula was actually reversed. Like, it was all these radical unconventional methods that appeared to be not helping the king that we saw in the beginning of the movie. And then that Lionel Lowe character, I mean, what was he really doing? It seemed like it was all just very conventional speech therapy stuff. I don't know. What else to say? The acting in the movie was really good. With a movie like this, I think it would be easy to either underact or overact this type of script. But I thought the actors hit it really pitch perfect. They say all their lines with, you know, with a bit of oomph to them, but you never really get to the point where you feel like they're overacting. Except the Churchill guy, the actor they got to play Winston Churchill. He seemed like he was almost more doing a caricature of Churchill. But granted, Churchill is kind of like Nixon or Elvis or something, where most people who play Churchill are doing a caricature. Unfortunately, he only has a minor role in this movie. He has such a minor role that you wonder why he's in the movie at all. It would have been very easy to leave him out altogether. I got the impression that he was shoehorned in because the studio wanted a British politician that Americans would recognize. They say, okay, World War II, leading up to World War II, American audiences are going to expect to see Churchill, so put him in there somewhere. Actually, some more nitpicks. One point in the film, George VI declares, without exception, every single monarch throughout history has succeeded another monarch who is either dead or nearly dead. I am the first monarch in history who has succeeded a king who is still very much alive. Or something like that. I'm quoting from memory because I wrote that down after I had already left the movie theater. But there was something to that effect where he said that in the movie. Now, I was watching that, and I had, at this point, very recently just finished David Starkey's Monarchy and BBC radio series This Sceptered Isle. And I was thinking to myself, but that's not right. There were several times where one king succeeded another king who was still very much alive. I mean, during the War of the Roses, there was that whole back and forth of the throne between King Henry VI and Edward IV. Or during the Glorious Revolution, right? King James II had to flee England when William of Orange took the throne. And then King James II was still very much alive for a long time after that. So it's a little bit odd. I don't know why they put that line in the movie. You would think a British king would know that history a little bit better. Okay, a couple more nitpicks. There was an interesting article in The Age, which is one of the major newspapers in Melbourne at the time. I'll link to it down below. Which said that there was some controversy about George VI, the main character in this movie. Apparently the historical figure had some accusations of anti-Semitism. And during the time when there was a lot of Jewish refugees fleeing from Europe, with the Nazis and everything, he went through some efforts to prevent them from actually settling in Palestine. this was not the time to be anti-Semitic with the Nazis rising. And sorry, let me turn this off a moment. Gonna have to remember to turn the phone off before I make these videos. So that was an interesting controversy. I'll link to that article in the description of this video. Also, there was another one. Christopher Hitchens did a review of this movie, which I'll again link to down below, which Christopher Hitchens criticized the movie for historical accuracy around Winston Churchill. In this movie, Winston Churchill is one of the main movers to get Edward VIII off the throne and replaced with somebody who is less problematic, because among other things, Edward VIII's apparent Nazi sympathies were causing problems. Christopher Hitchens points out this is a complete opposite of what the historical reality was. In reality, Winston Churchill was one of the last defenders of Edward VIII. Even though, Churchill said, Hitchens said Churchill really should have known better. This was not one of his best moments. But Churchill, right up into the last, was apparently supporting Edward VIII. So, yeah, what the movie shows of Churchill and what the historical reality of Churchill was apparently exact opposites. I'll link to the article by Christopher Hitchens down below. One last little mini controversy around this movie. There's a scene in this movie where, in order to, as part of the speech therapy, the therapist encourages George VI to just shout profanities into the microphone. It's something that's therapeutic and seems to kind of help him overcome his stutter. And because of that, there was all these controversies about the rating of the movie. It got rated R in the US. They wanted to do a re-edit of it for the Oscars so that it could get better Oscar consideration. They ended up cutting out parts of it for a PG-13 release of the movie. I'll link to an article again down below, but again, it just goes to show how ridiculous the movie rating system is, where profanity, just four-letter exclamations, which are completely meaningless, especially meaningless in this context, when they're just something you shout out, has such absurd power, and it really shouldn't. So, yeah, it's a ridiculous controversy. Goes to show how the whole obsession with four-letter words in the movie ratings industry is just completely broken. I'll link to that article down below.